Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Kagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
Spencer Ackerman, welcome to Fortress on a Hill. Thank you for coming to chat with me today.
Thanks for inviting me, Henry.
Really excited to talk to you. Just give a quick bio here for everybody. You're a contributing editor at the Daily Beast. From 2017-2021, you were a senior national security correspondent for the Daily Beast. And of course, today we're talking about your new book, Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. You also are a former national security editor at Guardian, and that you were on the Pulitzer Prize winning team covering Edward Snowden's revelations. So I wanted to take today to kind of hone in on veterans a little bit more. I've been watching lots of your interviews and different subjects being brought up. The two best I would definitely say was your spot on What a Hell of a Way to Die with Nate Francis, and your discussion with Ezra Klein. I found those really powerful, really illuminating. It's always easy when somebody comes at you as the fair broker and actually is willing to have that conversation that most Americans don't have. So I wanted to start with talking a little bit about untrooping, and that was something you talked about on What a Hell of a Way to Die quite a bit, and discussing Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning. I found it so powerful and moving. When you, in your book, describing what happened to her as torture, that we've gotten that out of our minds, how horrible our penal system is, and especially for people going through something like that. Definitely an example of the punishment by process that other people like Julian Assange have had to go through. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the war criminal angle, and about how some of those guys ended up getting untrooped, through no fault of their own. But talked a lot about Clint Lawrence, about his career, his times, the things that he went through, and that the kinds of betrayal that we're willing to acknowledge generally don't come from those kind of things. When a whole squad or platoon of soldiers gets sold out by their leader, and he ends up getting pardoned and gets to go on Fox News and talk about all this stuff, while his soldiers are maligned and treated like shit in the media, enough so much that one of them ended up having to change their name. I'm curious, what about the post 9/11 era people that have been convicted of war crimes? What has it pointed out to you? What is the between the Trump era, between movement towards more extremism? What is that? What has that shown to you, Spencer?
Mostly it shows you how the war on terror understands war crimes. A war crime is not a policy. It's a deviation from a policy. So, here's one example. We're talking a couple days after General Ray Odierno passed away. Odierno, probably your listeners don't need Any reminder, but for anyone who doesn't know, Odierno was the Army Chief of Staff. Before that, he ran the final phase of the occupation of Iraq. He was the Corps commander for David Petraeus during the surge. And before that, on his first tour in Iraq, he ran the 4th Infantry Division. What did he do when he ran the 4th Infantry Division? Basically, the 4ID used extremely brutal measures to attempt to pacify Western Iraq. So someone like Lieutenant Colonel Nate Sassaman, who was such a golden boy of the Army. He was a West Point quarterback. Odierno allowed Sassaman to exert dominance over his battle space by informing citizens of entire towns that they were under strict curfew, that they could come and go at the pleasure of the military. And if they defied orders that were issued to them in English only, they could be shot. That was an acceptable thing for a commander to order during the Iraq War. What we see as unacceptable are people who, through all fault of their own. I don't want to, say for a second that their crimes are not the result of choices they make, but someone like Clint Lawrence is taking an important cue about how the war and his superior officers view the disposable, how disposably his commanders view, in his case, Afghan lives. I think Lawrence, shows himself to be a coward by not just the way he perceives those lives to be so indisposable, but also how, he orders soldiers under his command for, I think, 2-3 days to become executioners, to become criminals themselves. There's not really, certainly we can, point out simultaneously that the war's systematic destruction and sort of deep dehumanization of people's lives are, an all-encompassing backdrop, while, tons and tons of, commanders, certainly, junior officers, certainly lieutenants, don't make the decisions that Lawrence makes, right? So I think there we see both the interplay of what's structurally at work and the uniqueness of the choices that people make for which they are responsible. The war on terror doesn't punish people above, particular ranks. It views someone like, Robert Bales, who murders, I think something 15, 16 Afghan men, women, and children, as the basest deviation from the war on terror. And while he certainly is a deviation for good order and discipline, and every aspect and more of his punishment he deserves, the war on terror, generally the military institutionally, cannot draw the parallels that are necessary in recognizing that the policies it pursues are the problem here. The policies it pursues are not just a problem for, and this is something you you very often hear from liberal criticism, that they're problems because they make things worse for the military. No, they're problems because of the overwhelming danger they pose to people's lives. And ultimately, you do that to enough people, and some small amount of them are going to seek revenge, and some smaller part of them are even going to achieve it.
I think the most disturbing thing about Lawrence's case, and I also think this ties into the military's legal response to it, was that had he just ordered his men to kill those innocent Afghans, it wouldn't have been something, I don't think, that would have been made as big a deal of. That the moment he started telling his troops to lie, to specifically, we will write this report the right way, we'll do, that we're going to do this, that it was a different problem for them. It was they I don't think that the death and destruction mattered as much as what he was doing under the surface there with his troops, and especially that he had been working previously at the one of the, I think, his battalion HQ, working intel, so he was very close to lots of people who would end up filing those kind of reports. I'm not saying it's acceptable in the least, but I think that it was, as morbid as it sounds, that having his troops murder people wasn't the biggest thing for him. But then again, it did only come a matter of months after what Robert Bales did. It was in the same, very close to the same region in Afghanistan. So there may have already been that underlying tension with that. And Bales was, I think, he's certainly, of the war on terror era, is the most egregious war criminal we've seen. And there never was a campaign for him to be pardoned, but these other lesser murderers, lesser liars, can slide in there a little bit easier.
When you were talking about untrooping, and you started talking about Lawrence, my thoughts turned to Eddie Gallagher, someone else who his fellow SEALs not only seek to testify against, and those of us who've covered the special operations community can just see how rare that is, like, especially considering, like, it's not exactly a secret that the SEALs have done some noxious shit, and, like, other members of the soft community, cough Delta cough, can tear their hair out about what the SEALs have gotten away with. And I have yet to read David Phillips' book Alpha, so I'm really looking forward to the depth of reporting on Gallagher. But the way in which Gallagher just absolutely lays in to all of his fellow SEALs who are testifying, like, using terms like evil to describe Gallagher. He is trying to perform a kind of untrooping. He is trying to make sure that he is the embodiment, for a lot of people, of naval special warfare, of being a SEAL. And given that, I consider it likely only a matter of time before Gallagher engages in politics, it's going to be revealing to see not only how that development unfolds, but who goes along with it and who challenges it.
I had Gallagher on my notes here, and it thinking about him reminded me of something that you touched on it briefly in the book, but it was about how our country and how the national security state has come to view civilians on the battlefield, and the use of the term human shields. Like in the campaign with ISIS, we knew that, there's lots of evidence to say that did happen. But for us to coin all of the people remaining in Mosul who are not combatants or ISIS as simply ending up being just pawns of what's happening there. Some of them are, I'm sure some of them are trapped, and that ISIS had part to do with it. But in terms of the lack of nuance in discussing that, And of course, the human shields thing takes on an entirely different outlook, looking in a place like Gaza. But back to Eddie Gallagher for a second, that that the special operations campaigns during the war with ISIS, that they didn't take prisoners, they just didn't. And that's one thing that we don't discuss very often, about what do our special forces allow proxy forces to do on their behalf, and exactly how ugly that is, that they end up, and like you said about Gallagher, is that it's, oh my god, it's such a oddity that his men, that the people he served with, were willing to go past that wall of silence, which is much, much thicker compared to, more ordinary military silence, to demean his fellow SEALs, even though they felt that they were doing the right thing. But I wonder if in the SEALs' mind, like you mentioned about their many crimes, is that something that they can even notice, let alone do something about?
Mosul in general, I think, is just a glaringly conspicuous phenomenon where it's undercovered. Just like this was a something like 9-month long urban battle. Like, when taking a kind of longer view of military history, a 9-month battle to take like a large city isn't particularly unusual in like the broad scheme of things. But in the last 2 generations of American warfare, it has been, and it's unique in the war on terror. What's also conspicuous about it is that because it was accomplished along the doctrine of by, with, and through, which is to say, in the air and when on the ground through proxy forces whenever possible. Unlike urban combat during the occupation of Iraq, it was extremely difficult to get, embedded with U.S. and Iraqi forces. Most of the reporting, certainly the good reporting, done out of the Battle of Mosul was typically unembedded. And, at tremendous risk, those of us who have done both embedding and unembedded reporting know, to those people bringing us that news. But, with notwithstanding, we could talk about this all day, the problems inherent in doing military embedded reporting. The alternative in the case of Mosul was that we just don't know nearly as much as we should about the way this extremely arduous battle unfolded, with, I couldn't even tell you the stats without Googling them. But, Mosul, I've been to Mosul. It's an enormous city. Fighting through it, especially through its density, is just a task horrifying to contemplate. And the fact that we don't know so much about something like this, that is quite possibly going to be a template for war in the future. I'm not saying it will, I'm saying it could, with a lot of people's conceptions about what urban warfare is developing into, is a really disturbing thing. I remember, I think General Townsend, who was in command of the Iraq-Syria war against ISIS at the time, is quoted in a piece that I cite in the book, saying that like this is the most intense urban combat that the U.S. has engaged in since Vietnam. And I think he might have even said not just urban, but like industrial conflict, which is a really tremendous thing to wrap your head around. And it is in that environment that I think about the ways in which the SEALs, who are, tasked with carrying out a tremendous amount against the Islamic State in Mosul, would then look at Gallagher, who seems like to take enjoyment in inflicting this kind of brutality. The story that he couldn't get prosecuted for because there's no body was that he was like taking shots when he would see women in hijab. And I think, you don't really have to go very far to recognize how wrong that is. Like, you can see that when it happens, and people, particularly like SEALs in a circumstance as wretched as, Mosul was, as wretched as every other deployment of so many that they would have been tasked with over their career as SEALs, who try and act in a valorous way in those circumstances, can see something very dangerous about Gallagher, not only dangerous to the human beings that he is targeting, but dangerous to those he would fight alongside, and dangerous to the institution that many of them really do take, very personally.
So, I really enjoyed your breakdown on John Kelly with Nate and Francis, and I wanted to ask you, and this is just kind of curiosity for me, but it really seems that John Kelly's, it's certainly more refined than this, but that he is almost a walking Vietnam syndrome in some ways. That the things that he envisions in terms of that, if we didn't, pull the boys out or not give them enough, whatever. And granted, his is a little more specific in terms of that anybody who insufficiently supports a conflict or who actually attempts to oppose it. Of course, this is a situation where someone like him would respond much worse to a veteran like me who wants to change the national security state versus other more typical people that just go out and be Americans. And that's one of the biggest things with veterans, is that most veterans come home and that's what they do. They try to go on living their lives, and that shouldn't be a problem, except for what is left in the wake of that time spent, what is left in the wake of a 4-year enlistment for somebody that, they were supply, or they were a medical job, or whatever it is, but at some point in there, they were involved in the chain to take violence to a specific place at for a specific reason, whatever that, however vague that happens to be.
I think, I remember when, Kelly gives that speech in St. Louis in 2010, where he's ventriloquizing these 2 Marines who are killed at a checkpoint in order to tell a story that holds civilian America in contempt. And I remember thinking that, like, there's a version of this that, like, I've heard a lot from veterans that, like, isn't as caustic, that's, like, much, on one hand, more searching about finding meaning in their war, and on the other hand, less enthusiastic about the war itself. When you find a war on terror veteran who has, like, very uncomplicated pro-war feelings, that's a unicorn. I don't, like, know very many, and B, like, red flag after red flag after red flag, right? Like, that's what is up with that. So I remember thinking that, while at the same time, like, the frustration with, like, most of the country not, on the one hand, really having any idea of what soldiering in these wars was, but on the other hand, being, like, pretty certain that they actually do have some idea, like, that's pretty frustrating. And, like, I can recognize that as someone who didn't serve but has, like, been to, like, Iraq and Afghanistan, right?
Sure.
And so I remember thinking back, Kelly's thing is that like it wasn't going to take root. Like it was the sort of thing that I think a lot of us were looking at it, if we, paid it much attention at the time. I think most in the media, we just didn't, for a variety of reasons, most importantly being that like everyone gave Kelly a tremendous amount of birth to grieve. This was so soon after his son dies in action in Afghanistan. But nevertheless, I think when we did look at it, we were looking at it as like a trend story, something that we were like, is this the way, Iraq, Afghanistan veterans of this generation, feel, and they are going to develop that feeling. And, after Kelly goes to work for Trump, it occurs to me that that was entirely the wrong way to go about looking at Kelly. It wasn't at all about what that speech said to veterans. It was about what that speech said to civilians. And it was useful for a political current like Trump and MAGA to say that the military is a Praetorian Guard. Its position in the country is a sacred one, and allegiance to it is to be determined by allegiance to an enterprise, not by the way you could, alternatively view it, keeping fidelity by materially improving the lives of people who serve in the war like they expect when they go in. Like what you never get from presentations like Kelly's, and certainly from less caustic presentations, the gauzy ones that you get either from, more, for lack of a better term, like, normie retired general and flag officers, or from politicians, is that like, these people enlisted because they wanted to serve a cause, higher than self and so forth. And like, that's there, and I've seen it. But what gets left out is like, it's also because like you promised them affordable education. And like lots of people who are here, when you talk to them candidly, are like, I needed a way to pay for college. I needed a way to do all of these other things that the Army or the Marine Corps or the Air Force or the Marines say that they would, less so the Marines certainly, less that, they will help me out with everything else I want to do with my life that doesn't involve being in the military. And that, I think, is one of the more important ways, certainly politically potent ways, that the redefinition of fidelity and social responsibility to the military has moved away from anything having to do with taking care of people, of human beings within it, and toward protecting allegiance to a political agenda, one that can be very easily manipulated. And that's a really dangerous thing. And Kelly's impact accelerating all of that, I think, is extremely underappreciated.
I read an essay recently by Elliot Ackerman, and he was it's called "Turning in My Veteran Card," and I didn't agree with everything he said, but in terms of that, veteran veneration has done nothing for the cause of veterans as taking care of them in those ways. I mean, there's a very shiny veneration that we give at NFL games and other such bullshit, but we don't. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't lift up veterans at all, and of course, it certainly doesn't lift up the victims of U.S. imperialism. But so I wanted to move on to talk a little bit about some of the effects on veterans between let's say, Timothy McVeigh's time and now, that in us talking about, Eddie Gallagher, that Timothy McVeigh went from someone who received super glowing reviews for his time in the military to becoming someone who was comfortable and committed mass murder. And Eddie Gallagher has got to be right there with him. But so much of the reality of, I don't know about Eddie Gallagher yet, but Timothy McVeigh has been cooked out of the story. You know, I didn't know until I read Catherine Ballou's book, the Bring the War Home, that his connections to white supremacy. I had never known about any of that, and it gives this much more complete picture of what he was. So that brings us to, you know, January 6th and the military trying to respond to extremism. And so what I'm wondering from you, Spencer, is, you know, you've written about many topics about veterans, about the national security state, and in terms of your experiences, your writing, is there actually space for veterans these days to find an actual sense of honor, that in terms of the mission, in terms of the what is cost, if let's say if reading Reign of Terror was a primer to joining, you know, military or intelligence service, and I'm using the term service and honor pretty loosely here, how can a veteran find positive meaning among a system where murder, where torture, secrecy, betrayal are not even the exceptions, but they are the rules, no matter how much they may say that they're not.
So that, I think, is one of the most profound questions of the entire war on terror. I can't presume to answer it. I can't presume to answer it for anyone else. I can't presume to answer it as someone who didn't soldier in these wars. I think that is a challenge that, like, thoughtful people are going to either take up or they're going to try and avoid, and rely on kind of all the kind of lazy ways that a pretty much otherwise indifferent society just wants to say, like, oh yeah, you're a hero, and like just, you know, give you your Applebee's discount and, you know, kind of move on. I think about a story I tell in the book that I saw in 2008 in Afghanistan, which was someone who I call Sergeant Rob. It's not particularly difficult to figure out who that is if you have Google. But I watched Sergeant Rob, who was the platoon sergeant during for a cavalry troop I accompanied in 2008 on a mission to hunt down a weapons cache and get a Taliban arms fencer. What ended up happening during that raid was Afghan police sought to rob the women who were living in the compound that got raided. And, you know, this is a real dicey circumstance, you know, in that moment, because on the one hand, the police are like very necessary partners for that cavalry troop. They have to work through the police according to their ROE. They, according also to rules set in place by the Afghan Ministry of Defense and at that time the president's office. Simultaneously, you know, the police are robbing people like in front of the Americans. And this sergeant has the presence of mind to, shall we say, encourage his lieutenant to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it happened at direct expense of their mission in this case. But I think he ultimately, you know, he was killed in action during a subsequent tour in Afghanistan. But, you know, during all the time I've spent reporting on Iraq and Afghanistan and the rest of the war on terror, that was the only actual act of heroism I ever witnessed. And I say that not to be part of this, I think, like, you know, condescending complex of just like finding service members and calling them heroes, but because like this was an actual circumstance of moral emergency and of choice. And this person made what I think was an extremely honorable choice, even if finding honor came at the expense of a mission that is as you describe. And if I have any way of addressing that question, it's to say that that is a way of making sense of someone's time serving in a dishonorable war that they had that they like borne no ultimate responsibility for how dishonorable it was. They were thrust into it. But again, like that is a very big question, and an extremely personal one. So I don't know if that answer has been useful at all, but it's as good as I have.
Our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters, helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out our honorary producers, and they are Will Arens, Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Zach H., Ren Jacob, Howard Reynolds, Why I Am Anti-War Podcast, Scott Spaulding, Kenneth Cordasco, Korgoth, and the Status Quo Podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our awesome store on Spreadshirt.com for some great Fortress merch. The link is in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the podcast. These days I suggest to people that if you're going to thank people for their service, that as opposed to using the word service, people could say something along the lines of like, thank you for your sacrifice. Because in some way or another, that person did, even if they, were in the States for their time, they never deployed or anything like that, that we need to look at it in an entirely different way, more so at the human cost. But separate from that, and I think more important than saying something like thank you in any form, is that instead of thank you for your service, it should first and foremost be tell me about your service.
Yeah.
And some veterans may say no. They may say they're not comfortable with it, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But people need to take the deliberate action of saying, I'm not going to accept the phony baloney veteran veneration. I'm going to talk to this veteran, and I'm going to let them tell me what it was really like without overly using the words good or bad, just what happened to them. And we have to get away from the mindset, because not everybody wants to be venerated, but also is that people need to know that our country should care about what happens to service members. They should care about that damage in a much bigger and expansive way than they do. But like I mentioned earlier, that the idea of veneration, it doesn't do veterans any favors, other than, like I said, in a very vague, flashy NFL on Sunday kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tool, designed to exploit you, right? Like it gives you nothing. It is forgotten immediately. It's a substitute, something like "thank you for your service," for engagement, which is what it postures as. Like it's almost like table manners. You're getting something out of the way before you move on to the thing that you're trying to get to.
Sure.
And that's a shitty way to treat people, right? Like that's not.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So I think from the civilian side, something that can happen is that like the post 9/11 culture of veneration like just ends up drawing extremely sharp divides. This is what Kelly kind of wants to embrace, between like who counts as a true American versus who exists as a conditional American. And for a certain sort of person who doesn't serve, but also like doesn't really have a critique of the war or like much interest in it, and like just goes about like living their life and isn't really concerned by the kinds of questions that brought us to this conversation today. Then like if such a person finds themselves in a circumstance where like they're around a veteran who announces themselves as such, that's sort of like the social rules of the game, right? Like it's they're acknowledging something to get out of the way that they have been made to feel a different kind of social inferiority. And so they're sort of nodding at they're nodding at that order. They're nodding at the expectation that they at that moment are meant to acknowledge that they did not perform such a sacrifice. And now that we've gotten that kind of ritualistic humiliation out of the way, basically like this does no good for anybody.
No.
Like it's just like an awful arrangement that's entirely unnecessary. But I think we're going to grow more accustomed to, as on the one hand, the military through like the creation of the all-volunteer military becomes more of both like a distinct social class and also, as is I think a pretty disturbing phenomenon, like a kind of family affair, not just for officers but for enlisted people, having just increasingly less and less interaction with kind of America more broadly, and then also America's just straight up devotion to remaining globally hegemonic, which will lead to more and more war.
So I want to make sure I'm attentive for your time. I know you're a really busy guy putting the book out and everything. Before I close, I had one more question for you, and this is kind of a Cold War on Terror comparison, but that the where we are right now. This is mid October. We've withdrawn from Afghanistan. We've just had the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I know you are a native New Yorker, still live there, and so my question is about what about studying the global war on terror really surprised you? What was the what are the hallmarks that reading about in history that it's going to end up being? What do you think the telltale signs are, and especially from where we were, say, just right around early 90s?
I think that in context, I'm working on a piece about this to try and draw out the Cold War stuff, but the way in which the war on terror reflects a lot of second time as farce aspects of the Cold War, where a kind of unserious threat inflation of beyond Al Qaeda to something vast and over intellectualized while being a stupid concept that becomes known as radical Islamic terror becomes, for certain classes, elite classes of Americans, takes on a kind of totemic role comparable to the Soviet Union. And by comparable, I mean in the sense of like creating out of, very thin historical gruel, a global capable threat, not just to American lives, but to the American way of life. And like, this is always bullshit, but it also reflects, and this is the case probably for, every war, it reflects how the dominant mode of politics wants to view the Cold War in retrospect as a good and evil story, where, the good United States and its friends vanquishes the evil Soviet Union and its sycophants. And the more you read the Cold War as history, and the more you read like real histories of the Cold War, like just absolutely none of that resembles reality. Just none of it. The United States, particularly through the CIA, but also through the military at times, engages in campaigns so bloody that in circumstances like Indonesia, they cross over into being like outright genocides. And then global anti-communism, sponsored by the United States, is a force of global destabilization, by design, and it is not strictly a force focused on communism, but also against social democracy, and also against other forms, less, recognizably, in a Marxist tradition, but in local and syncretic traditions that nevertheless threatens the interests of capital. And that is what the Cold War is. And that is also, through misremembering and whitewashing the Cold War, a way in which the war on terror became truly a forever war, became, something that was sold, through the prism of, American legacy, part of a proud tradition of America aiding in the liberation of the world. And now this would happen in the Muslim world. And that story is always a bullshit story. It's always a manipulative story. It's always an exploitative story, and it's never a true story. But it is a very potent story. And it's going to be one to look out for when we start seeing historical writing about a war on terror that remains ongoing.
Aside from probably China and Russia, what calls out to you as a possibility for the next nebulous enemy? The next, we're slowly moving away from anti-terrorism, and that China, I think, would be the simplest and probably most obvious one. But again, the China is too specific. China, if it is if it is focused on China, crap. Sorry, man, I lost my train of thought.
No, don't worry, I can jump in.
All right, go for it.
I think we may end up seeing a sort of bifurcation where elite foreign policy professionals have as their primary preoccupation China, and whatever it is, great power competition is going to be cashed out as. But we're also going to, I think, in a really disturbing way, encounter is another acceleration of a trend that's very visible now. And when you think about it, really does exist throughout all of American history. But nevertheless, we're looking at it right now, which is the increasing normalization of violence as an adjunct to a normal part of politics. This is what goes into voter suppression. This is certainly what the insurrection was about. And the more normal this becomes, the more glaring the bifurcation between like how elites in both parties talk about like the great danger China poses to the outlook of the 21st century. And it's like, well, China doesn't threaten me, but the guy parading down the street in military cosplay, open carrying, talking about Jews not replacing him. I kind of think that's a more urgent thing to deal with, and also recognize that like a lesson of the war on terror we really ought to keep in mind right now is that we're facing an enormous political challenge in the breakdown of democracy and in the erosion of a faith that politics and violence are opposites in kind of normal discourse, which is that political problems can't be solved with security solutions. I just don't see how a more glaring lesson of the war on terror exists than that. And watching the ways in which we don't really have a political response to January 6th, we have an FBI response to January 6th, is something that's just very conspicuous to me.
So I think that's a good spot for us to close up the discussion. I wanted to ask you a couple questions about your comic interests. You are getting ready to get to write a Suicide Squad comic. I can't tell you how awesome that is, dude.
Thank you.
No, I find that's one area where I find a lot better criticism of the war state is in comics. That the original Civil War with Cap and Iron Man,
Totally.
there were actual questions answered. There was actually that they really tried to take the notion of the Marvel universe and give it a spread like we had seen coming out from 9/11. I had wondered, have you ever read Avengers Endless Wartime?
No, I haven't. Which one is that?
That one, it's a graphic novel. It's a one shot. But essentially, what happens is that there's a country that the U.S. is involved in regime change operations, and some of their hired thugs, I don't know how we want to call that, they shoot down what they think is an American drone, and they find out that it's actually connected to a living being. That they're actually for some fusion of mystical and sci-fi type stuff, that these drones they can create their own bombs, that they find their own targets, and just that the whole idea of a drone, big or small, becomes endless. It just becomes and the criticism in the story is amazing, but the idea that we so feed this beast that we don't even understand fully what it damages, what it really does. We think it protects us because we pay the money and we don't care about it and we don't watch it on the news. But it's a really powerful story. It's not a terribly long one. I think you'd really dig it. I did want to ask you if maybe sometime in the future you'd come back and discuss Civil War with me,
I would love to do that.
We can.
I reread that one a lot. So yeah, whenever you want to do that, let's do it.
That would be awesome, dude. It's one that I read pretty often as well. I'm rereading Spider-Man's arc in it, and how horribly his whole life gets changed and destroyed because he was trying to make Tony happy, and it's just awful to see. But the criticism is amazing. They some stories are just rise above and really talking about what the actual mood of something is. One of the reasons that sometimes fiction is better than nonfiction in telling those stories that we can't really get a grasp on. So, Spencer, thank you so much for your time, for being here today, and also thank you for the reminder that non-veterans are able to see the strings in the puppet show and become angry as everybody else pretends that they're invisible and yet essential. Will you tell the folks where they can find your work?
Well, thanks very much. Really appreciated this conversation, and looking forward now to our next one. You can find me on Substack. I write a newsletter called Forever Wars. For the next little bit, that's going to be the primary place where you can check out my journalism. The book is called Reign of Terror: How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. That's out at booksellers everywhere. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Ackerman also. And next year, you can find me at your comic book shop for the Suicide Squad book that I can't yet fully talk about.
It sounds amazing, dude. I'm gonna be there. I'm gonna pick it up as soon as I possibly can. I always feel guilty for using Marvel Unlimited because I don't have comic books. I can't touch them, and that I can read all of them, but they're not my comic books. So Spencer, thank you, and really look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Same, Henry. Thanks a lot. Take care.
All right, take care. We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not detain